So, to jump back into the conversation about building LGBTQ plus inclusive communities, we have to think about our coworkers too. So, because they can serve as active allies as well, in addition to administrators at our schools. So, it's important to start conversations with them about LGBTQ plus issues. That's a very good, easy first step. And they can be more formal conversations about school policies or local, state, or national legislation, whether this is in an actual meeting or just, talking to someone at lunch. And through those conversations, you can create action steps together, like I mentioned in that last bullet point there. Or they can just be super casual and more conversational. But regardless, starting to have more conversations about the LGBTQ plus community just normalizes those topics in daily conversation too, in daily interactions. So another thing to keep in mind would be to make sure you call out any homophobic or transphobic language, even when there are no students around. So kind of what we just talked about as well. Make sure you correct them if they misgender a student. And that's a way to continue your active allyship, not just when students are around, but in your daily life. A couple other points to add would be to introduce your students to other coworkers with their correct name and pronouns, again, to normalize it. And just generally be aware of how you and your coworkers might be preventing access to important resources for students. So, for example, avoid using gender-neutral student bathrooms if you have them on campus. Then here are some tips on how to build inclusive communities with parents, and we're going to expand on this a lot, so don't worry. But first off, just make sure you always check in with your students before talking to their parents about gender or sexual identity, because you don't want to inadvertently out someone. So that's why in that scenario I just mentioned, I would first go to the student and then from there be able to make some kind of action plan. And with elementary students, you might need a little extra support from counselors if you do want to contact parents or how the conversation goes. But that's why it's important to at least talk to the student first and try to have as much of a conversation about this on how to support them as you can. Another thing to do would be to stand up for your students if they're having difficulty with their parents. So you can be a really valuable and important ally to LGBTQ plus students by helping talk through things with their parents. So if they do want you to talk to their parents, you can help talk through things that they might not be able to. Either because emotionally they don't want to, or maybe they just don't have the language or the understanding yet. Or again, support the student in talking to their parents. So you can give the student resources, or you can give them resources to give to their parents, or again, just, different layers of support based on what the student needs. Give parents resources to learn more about LGBTQ plus identities. And, this might include going to your supervisor or administrator and creating opportunities for professional development for parents. Or even, including something in like a back to school packet or something, like some important resources there, or finding workshops they can attend to further educate themselves on LGBTQ plus identities. Or you can even suggest starting a parent affinity group for LGBTQ plus parents, or a DEI group where they can discuss gender and sexual identity specific topics with other parents. I think that would be great too. And it can be facilitated by you or another coworker, or it can just be parent led. So like I said, we're going to expand a little bit more on talking with parents, because that is definitely an important factor when thinking about building LGBTQ plus inclusive schools and communities for elementary students specifically, because of the fear of it being not age appropriate. So this can be tricky for sure, talking with parents about this in terms of the inclusive curriculum you want to implement. But again, we are here to help you. There is a whole section in our elementary educator toolkit that goes over the questions you see on this slide. So I'm going to go over them briefly, but if you want even more context and information, and again, language to use when talking to parents, please go access the toolkit and look through this section, because it's very, very valuable. And yeah, we'll talk about it more here too. So so addressing, for example, why is LGBTQ plus curriculum necessary? So this answer involves our duty as educators to counteract and disrupt the hate, the bullying, the discrimination that LGBTQ plus students face on a daily basis, like that national and local data we saw earlier, and how we as educators want to create a safe, supportive learning environment for all students. And then, like I said, in the toolkit, there are some relevant statistics you can use in conversations with parents just to provide some empirical data, or you can use the data we talked about earlier, like I said. Another question would be, are elementary school students too young to learn about gender and sexuality? Now, we know the answer to that. We discussed that earlier. But in the toolkit, we provide even more statistics and research, including the study we talked about earlier in the workshop, to back up basically the firm answer that no, they are not too young to learn about gender and sexuality. And actually, they are already thinking about it. And so providing them a space to do so will help them in that journey. And then the next one would be, ideas about gender and sexual diversity go against the values we are instilling in my child at home. Are you trying to teach my child to reject those values? Again, the answer here would be no. We can acknowledge that we respect that students and their families will have different values and beliefs. We talked about that in the policy section, that we might all have different opinions, and that's okay. But having said that, we will not accept bullying or harassment on the basis of gender or sexual identity. So being very clear and abrupt about that. Then, why are you teaching about sexuality in elementary school? Is this the same as sex education? And then the answer here includes a description in the toolkit of why teaching about sexual identity is not the same as sex education, and that's a common misconception, and how because of that we plan on implementing age-appropriate curriculum. So no, this is not sex education, and learning about sexuality or sexual identity is not the same, and how it is in fact age-appropriate and important. So again, I just briefly went over the answers for those types of questions, but there's so much more language in the toolkit you can use, and in addition to that, we also have included a letter to parents in the toolkit that you can send out prior to teaching about gender and sexual identity. In addition, there's a letter that administrators can send out to the school community, which might even be better to have that administrator support. And this letter is about how the school strongly values educational equity and inclusion for LGBTQ plus and BIPOC students. So that's a valuable resource as well. All right, so LGBTQ plus education for young children. So these would be other points of emphasis for skeptical parents or coworkers or even larger school communities. And this is kind of a summary of what we've already talked about too. So LGBTQ plus education for young children looks like developmentally appropriate education about different types of people and families. So supporting self-exploration, introducing pronouns and vocab, discussing gender stereotypes, creating a supportive environment for all students to thrive. So again, this is all stuff that we've already talked about, but this is another thing that you could bring to parents, even if you want, even in this kind of format. Like, it looks like this and it does not look like that, to be fully visible and transparent. And so this type of education is crucial for students' personal identity development, their language development when discussing identities, and the support for students of all identities. So that's another kind of selling point that you could use, even though it shouldn't even have to be sold. That's a side note. And then in terms of the does not look like bullet points, it does not look like teaching young children about sex or introducing any other age inappropriate topics. So kind of like what we just covered, making judgments about someone's identities, and does not look like convincing students to identify a certain way. It is not sex ed. It is age appropriate. It is valid. It is real. It is important, and end of story. That's pretty simply put. But yeah, I think the convincing students one can be one that can come up as well that I have seen. And it's not a convincing matter. It's not telling someone how to live their life. It's purely giving a more equitable and inclusive perspective on identities that we haven't talked about enough in the past. So this slide is an important one, this next one about inclusive policies and infrastructure, because it lists several specific ways to develop inclusive policies and infrastructure within your schools for both students and anyone in the school community. So earlier we discussed inclusive policies for the classroom, and now we're zooming out a little bit again and looking at specific school policies. So there are several important ideas here, like changing administrative records to reflect a student's or person's correct name and pronouns, and offering more inclusive options for their gender or other identities in those records too. I know from like a technological standpoint that can be pretty difficult, but that is a very easy way to make things more inclusive. So, for example, a parent doesn't have to choose Mr. or Mrs. Or a student, if they decide to go by a different name, like a chosen name, then you can easily change that. Or you can indicate their pronouns in their administrative record. So if a sub comes in, or even a teacher can look and see that this is their pronoun and not lead to any misgendering or uncomfortable situations. Another important idea would be, again, like what we've talked about, regularly using students or people's chosen names and pronouns and encouraging others to do the same. And then, of course, stepping in when others don't. Adding more gender neutral or all gender restrooms. This is something that I think is slowly starting to happen at more campuses around Marin, but obviously this is another thing that you could advocate for. Not reinforcing the binary and not forcing students to choose a male or female restroom, and instead just having a gender neutral one. And in addition to gender neutral restrooms, just locker rooms as well and other facilities. That probably is applicable a little bit more to the middle school, high school age, but it's important to have gender neutral facilities on several parts of campus, not just for bathrooms. Developing and implementing anti-biased and inclusive hiring practices that ensures that your faculty staff will have a diverse representation of all identities. So ensuring that you have faculty and staff that identify as LGBTQ+, and learning from their stories and their experiences, and then also, like, for example, maybe they'd be interested in leading a student affinity group or something like that. So just making sure that your hiring practices are anti-biased and inclusive as well. And then it's also important to think about the access that students and staff have to supportive spaces on campus, kind of like what I just said about affinity groups or student clubs or teacher clubs or actual physical spaces to go to. And that goes hand in hand with ensuring that all students and staff have access to mental health support on and off campus as well. According to a study by UT Austin in 2018, trans people who are able to use their chosen name in any single context in their life, such as at school, experienced 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, 2, a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, 3, 65% decrease in suicidal attempts. Oh, just kidding. It's just 3, not 4. But so anyway, to sum up, this study by UT Austin showed that trans people who are able to just be themselves and bring their identities with them to any context, whether it be school or work or whichever, have fewer symptoms of depression, show a decrease in thoughts of suicide or even suicidal attempts. So, should have provided a little content warning there. I apologize. But to continue the conversation, another thing that you can do for inclusive policies would be inclusive and updated dress code policies and specific equitable protocols for how teachers and administrators should address and handle LGBTQ+ mistreatment, harassment, reporting, Title IX and mandated reporter training. That one I have personally seen could definitely use some update and more training on. So those are all areas that are highly important when focusing on building inclusive communities, not just in your classroom, but for the entire school population and community. That includes alumni, parents, faculty, staff, everyone. So, as you can see on this on the workshop slides here, we are approaching a break. So if you would like to take a few minutes just to stretch your legs, get some water, do whatever you need to do, and then we will dive into our last section.